Today, we're going to talk about how to know the will of God for our lives and how to distinguish the biblical will of God from the lie that's propagated today using the Bible itself. And we'll do that right after this. Welcome, everybody, and today we're going to look at how to determine what the will of God is for our lives using the biblical truth and how to distinguish that from some of the modern lies that are propagated today. And we'll be able to learn to distinguish the difference between the two by using God's will itself. And before we begin, I just want to let everybody know that we'll be using this book right here, the Book of Romans by Ernest Huddleston. This is put together by us here on Scripture Only 101, and it's available on Amazon. It's not a requirement, but if you want more detail than what we have in the studies online, you can get that and use it as a resource. So let's continue on. So what does it mean to walk in the will of God, and how do we know what God's will is for our life? Well, I think that the easiest way to do that would be able to recognize what is not God's will for our lives by knowing what God's true will looks like. When people at the banks are trained to look for counterfeit money, they typically don't train them on what all the counterfeit looks like. What they'll do is they'll teach them what the truth and what the true currency looks like. And by knowing that, they can then recognize what's counterfeit. So for us to start to understand what God's will looks like for someone's life, we have a perfect example in the Apostle Paul. And we'll read from Romans chapter 1, verses 9 through 10. And we'll see what Paul says as he's writing in this letter to the church at Rome. So what he says is, beginning in verse 9, "For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, that without ceasing I mention you always in my prayers, making request," and this is what the key point is right here, "making request, if by some means now at last I may find a way in the will of God to come to you." So Paul was seeking a way in the will of God to come and visit those at the church at Rome. So let's think about this for a minute. It's believed that when this letter was written to the Romans, Paul was in the area of Ephesus. So using a little bit of geography, we can determine that if Paul wanted to go to Rome from Ephesus, the easiest thing to do would be to catch a ship and go west from Ephesus to Rome. And, if he was going to go according to his own desires, that would be what he did. And it would have been the easiest thing to do. But he wasn't seeking his own desires. He was seeking the will of God. So let's look at what did he do after writing this letter? How did he eventually end up in Rome? Well, if we start looking at the book of Acts in chapter 20, we start seeing what Paul went through to eventually end up in Rome. We know that after he left the Ephesus area, he went to Jerusalem with the goal of aiding the church there because they had been struggling. When he arrived there, he went into the temple, and it caused quite an uproar with the Jewish leaders there, and they formed a mob against him, and they wanted to kill him. They dragged him out of the temple because he professed to be a follower of Christ, and then started beating him. Well, imagine this. The way Paul was rescued from that beating was to be arrested by the Romans and then scourged by the Romans in an attempt to gather information. Well, he was, after that, to be assassinated by the Jews. They formed a plot against Paul and took an oath not to even eat until they had carried out their plan to assassinate Paul. So to protect Paul, it took 400 Roman soldiers to escort him out of the area to Felix the governor at that time. So when he met Felix, he was able to testify about the Lord to Felix and what the Lord had done in his life. He appealed to Caesar in Rome, so he was granted that request of his, being a Roman citizen. And so when they did that, they took him to a ship, and aboard that ship there were other prisoners, and a centurion named Julius. Julius was in charge. Well, Paul found favor with Julius, and Julius treated him well. They set sail. Their ship endured a hurricane, basically a hurricane, for 14 days. They all thought they were going to die. They were shipwrecked on Malta when they ran the ship aground, so they all survived. Well, you'd think everything was okay then. Well, what Paul faced after that was it was cold. It was that time of year, so they went to gather some wood. Paul gathered some wood, threw it on the fire. When he threw it on the fire, a viper came out and bit him on the hand. Well, the locals there on Malta thought, well, surely this guy must be guilty, because the sea should have got him, but the sea didn't get him. But yet his judgment is coming because the viper came out and bit him. Well, to their surprise, Paul suffered no ill effects from the viper bite. And not only that, while he was there, he prayed for a man, and the man was healed. Well, when that happened, word got out, and they brought others around to him, and they were healed too. So Paul and the others spent 3 months there on the island of Malta, telling about the Lord, teaching about the Lord. Other people were healed and things like that. So after that 3 months, they left Malta for Rome, and he arrived there. When he arrived in Rome, the other prisoners were handed over to the guards there, but Paul, because he had found favor with the Romans, was allowed to live in his own apartment with a soldier to guard him for the period of 2 years. And it says in Acts that during that period of 2 years, he was able to receive any guest that he wanted to receive, and he was given a lot of freedom to share the gospel with many people, including having access even to the household of Caesar, to share the gospel with the leaders and with the household people that were of the leaders of the household of Caesar. So Paul had quite an adventure to get there, but in the end, it all worked out. So, you may say, why is this important? What does all this have to do or say about walking in God's will? Well, when we look at Paul, if he was going to serve his own interest, wanting recognition, trying to boost his own image, he would have left Ephesus and gone straight to Rome. But instead, he followed God's will and went to Jerusalem, where he took that long journey that he did, suffering what he did, in order to get to Rome. So when he arrived in Rome, if he had come from Ephesus, he could have told about Christ. But the way that he did arrive, he had quite a story to tell of God's deliverance, and he was able to witness and testify to the very leaders of Rome themselves. So we see that God's will is different than what we may want to do if we're serving our own interest. So how was Paul able to endure these things? It was quite an ordeal. It says in Romans 1, verses 16 through 17, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. For it is in the righteousness, for in the righteousness of God is revealed, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. So when it comes by the will of God, if we're walking in his will and we have faith in him, we have a guarantee. It's the guarantee that he's going to watch out for us. There's always a purpose in God's will. Many times we'll go through things that test our faith. But during that period of testing our faith, our confidence in God is built, and it provides opportunity for God to show his deliverance in things that we may face during that time, let alone the fact that we'll meet people along the way that need to hear the message that God has given us. That is the truth about walking in the will of God. We go through trials and things sometimes, but it's all according to his will. And in the end, we'll see a deliverance that is a testimony of God's faithfulness to those who follow him. So there is a lie that we hear today. Some of it may be out of ignorance, some of it may be out of for other reasons, but there are those that will say, if anything happens in our life that's bad, it's because there is sin in our life. Well, that's not true. That's a lie. There are other things taught that if we're walking in God's will, that we're all going to be wealthy, have fine houses, fine cars, be rich. That again is a lie. God will provide for everything that we need, but it's not about us. There's a lie out there that says that we can have our best life now. Well, we know that the best is yet to come as we follow the Lord. And, so that leads us to ask, what is God's will for our life? Well, Jesus said, beginning in Matthew chapter 22, beginning in verse 37, Jesus said, the will of God is this: love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So the commandments is love God and love our neighbors. That's the commandments. Jesus also said in Matthew chapter 16, beginning in verse 24, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. For what is it to profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? That is the will of God, that we follow him and obey him, and we take up our cross and we follow Christ. And if we do that, everything else will work itself out. Now that leads us to conclude that it's not always comfortable walking in God's will. Sometimes we go through uncomfortable situations and challenging situations, but there's a reward in the end. Job is an example. In the book of Job, we know that he lost everything, and he had 3 friends that tried to tell him that there was something wrong in his life or it wouldn't have happened. But we know in the end that Job said, my ears had heard, but now my eyes have seen. So in the end, Job knew God better, and he had double what he had to begin with. So it's in our best interest to be obedient to God and walk according to his will. Well, that concludes today's lesson. Next time, we're going to talk about God's wrath. So be sure to stay tuned for that, and we'll see you then.